First of all, thank you all for some really insightful comments. It was clear and succinct analysis from each of you that was actually really interesting. I wanted to explore something that I think we started to get to in the last question, which is this notion of transparency to the taxpayer. We have this code that seems to have myriads of provisions that are aimed at triggering various kinds of behaviors, whether it's work or subsidizing various activities. But they only work if the person, in general, the person who's eligible for them can actually understand and see them. And so I wonder if, as we think about tax simplification, whether that might not be one of the principles that should underlie what we end up with, something that actually means that even an economist would agree the incentives are apparent to the taxpayer, and therefore you might actually get the results you're trying to get.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that this is a major concern of the taxpayer advocacy panels that have been created to hear taxpayers' concerns around the country, the designs of forms, the contents of the instructions, but plain English rewrites of all of the forms and instructions are going to be vital going forward. On the Senate side, Senator Warner has expressed some concerns and some interest in ordering the Government Accountability Office to do actually a plain English survey of tax forms and instructions. That'd be very valuable.
Yeah, there's a professor up at Carnegie, one of the Pennsylvania schools. He's an economic professor up there, has been doing some research using some program that measures the level of language within IRS forms and instruction booklets, and finds that they're written at a much higher level than what even your average newspaper, daily newspaper, would be written at. So it makes them very complicated for people who are just trying to get by in life to actually comply with them.
If I can just, I think that to that point of, are these provisions actually doing what they are intended to do? I think that goes to the Restructuring Commission's recommendation about the quadrennial review, that you are actually looking at, is this provision that we enacted to have this result actually getting this result? The other thing that I would suggest is that as Congress is writing legislation, it really does need to have frontline IRS technical people. And I would suggest some of those people might be the forms and publications people on the staff of the IRS. As you have a provision, try to translate that into what that form is going to look like. Before you enact it, try to come up with a draft of the instructions before you enact it. Because when you see what you have to write to get it explained to taxpayers, it's just astonishing, and they will not get it right. They will not understand.
There's a question over here, sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Kammi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is, due to the fact that IRS doesn't have tremendous resources for auditing, and it has a lot of goodwill, I guess. So do we really need any major reform? Because as an ordinary taxpayer, I don't see it very complicated because I filed by TurboTax. But a few years ago, I did lot of trading. It was more than $1 million, and I spent a lot of time with Fidelity Investment to understand it, but I couldn't get it. And I was hoping that IRS is going to audit me, but they never did. As a matter of fact, I expect every year, because I don't, even though I have degree in economics and then I have an MBA, but I really, when I file it, I think if Turbo is not there, I wouldn't know ABC of tax filing. So but I was never called. So I think, what is the point of doing this? It seemed very complicated when I hear an expert like you, but when we do on Turbo, it's not that difficult.
You've been looking over your shoulder for the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I always expect that they would call me for auditing, but they never did it. So it means either they have a lot of goodwill and good faith in American.
That's a good question. Has software and all of that simplified things, even though it's more complicated, for those who are still doing it with pencil and paper? And
I actually, my personal opinion is, I mean, the software programs are wonderful, but I think they have enabled complexity. They have facilitated it because you can say, well, the machines will work it out. You know, all somebody has to do is we're going to have questions and then you plug in the answer. And so that has enabled people to add on more and more complexity on the legislative side because the machines will work it. And I think that actually what that does overall, I just did a conference, we just held a conference, an international conference on taxpayer rights, and we had a panel on the impact of knowledge on tax compliance. And there is a lot of research out there that shows that as taxpayers have less and less knowledge about what is actually going on in their financial affairs, it has a negative effect on compliance because they don't trust, they have more suspicion, and it just feels, particularly if you do get something wrong, arbitrary and capricious. And so I think all of those things militate, even though it may be easy for you or you can use software and computationally it's easy, I think it's very difficult to design a software program that gets every single answer. And many of these returns that we get in for earned income credit are software prepared or the preparers are using software. And you still get these high errors. So, you know, I don't think that's a reason to not simplify.
There's also some things that the software just can't get at, and with respect to the family provisions, it's the question of whose return does this child belong on, and the software just can't determine that. You're supposed to figure out who the child lived with the majority of the year, and that's based on who they spent the most nights in the house with. Well, what if someone else provides more support? What if the couple breaks up halfway through the year? These are the kinds of questions that the software can't even get at. You're cohabiting, who gets the kid if you're not both biologically related, things like that still exist in the family arena.
Well, there are issues too, as the legislators are trying to become more refined in who they're targeting benefits to. Children under 6, children under 17.
Right.
Well, none of that information is on a 1040, is it?
Right.
So how is anyone to be able to?
You know,
comply
one of
with
the data points that we came up with this year in the annual report to Congress, which is just, every year there's one that just gobsmacks me. And it's that for fiscal year 2016, Treasury estimated that the tax expenditures, the spending programs running through the Internal Revenue Code is $1.47 trillion for 2016. The entire direct discretionary spending budget for the entire federal government was $1.2 trillion. So we are running more spending programs through the Internal Revenue Code than we are in our discretionary direct spending budget. And that includes military. So when you think about that, you know, that's where all the complexity is built in, that you've got this provision here for this group and this provision here for this group. We did something a few years ago, and this goes to software, where when Hurricane Katrina had hit and Congress enacted all sorts of provisions to benefit the victims of Hurricane Katrina. And in Free File, there were about 9 programs that incorporated those provisions into the software, but the rest of those programs did not. And there was nothing prompting the Katrina victim. They weren't asking, are you a victim of Katrina? So those benefits went unused. And when you think about that, it's like, well, now, how did that work? You know, that we had benefits out there and they weren't claimed. And can you force people to program those things in? And we've got a whole point of free enterprise here. So it gets very, very complicated.
Well, I want to be mindful. One last question?
This question's for Kyle.
Oops, we need a microphone.
Among the pending proposals you see around family tax policy and simplification policy, which ones do you see have strong bipartisan support and which ones are more contentious?
I don't know if I can comment on that right now. I mean, I think it all depends on how they're going to be structured at the end of the day. You know, 2 of these, of course, are campaign proposals. You can look at the Trump proposal. That one wasn't fully fleshed out in the campaign. I think there are still some questions about whether that one would work in practice. I think there are ones that could be structured in ways that could get some bipartisan support, but I'm not sure at this point which ones you could point to.
Well, perhaps we can have just a quick, I'm mindful of everyone's time, but we have congressional staff here and we have a pipeline to members, and so maybe a last wrap-up message from each of you on what you would tell members as they think about tax reform and how you can have a simple tax system for complex family matters.
So the tax system does two things. It collects money. It also sends money out, and it sends a tremendous amount of money out to very low-income families who are dependent on that assistance. It's the largest anti-poverty program. It's built into the tax system, and I think members of Congress need to be very mindful when the tax code gets opened of both of these functions that are happening so that we don't end up unwittingly taking away the support that people depend on.
I would just say, as you approach tax reform, too, as you think about corporate tax reform, do not forget about individual tax reform. I think we've shown the burden on folks in that way. And I think really understanding how people live their lives, not making them conform to some picture that is ideal, but rather understanding how they live their lives and conforming the code to that is really the point of view that will help the IRS, that will help taxpayers. It will reduce their burden.
This is a tremendous opportunity to restore confidence in the tax system and not only taxpayer rights, but remedies. By simplifying the system, by creating institutional processes to encourage simplification going forward, families are going to be helped. And we shouldn't overlook the fact that micro businesses, everything from the sharing economy to sole proprietorships, are going to be a way to upward mobility for millions more families. Making sure that the burden of compliance is simple for those types of businesses is key in any tax reform process.
2 points. So one, there's always trade-offs in tax reform. I think a good place to address some of the challenges with family tax policy or some of the fixes is a reform package, but you have to remember what you may be giving up at the same time. And the second point I want to make, and it's just based on what Pete said earlier, is that the failure to repeal and replace the ACA does not make tax reform $1 trillion more difficult. That number, of course, is not just the tax cuts that they failed to repeal, but also the coverage provisions in there. But it's also a point to be made that you do not need to repeal the ACA taxes as part of tax reform. That it's not really a baseline issue, and that I think that the challenge of tax reform is it's as challenging as it was going to be whether or not the ACA was repealed and replaced.
Well, I'd like to, let's all thank our panel for a wonderful presentation. I want to, just on behalf of the Tax Foundation and Intuit, I want you to stay tuned. We'll be planning a third of our series in the coming weeks on a topic to be determined. And I tell you what, the topics are only getting more interesting. And stay tuned for a great debate on tax reform. This is going to be a fascinating year for all of us tax nerds. This is what we've been waiting a lifetime for.